At the start of the year, I made the promise to myself that I was going to be reading 52 books in 2018. That is, a book for every week of the year. And so far, we're halfway through the year, and I'm right on track. I've read 26 books. I wanted to share the lessons that I've learned from reading these books, ordered from the least impact to the most impact in this video. And I'd like to also mention before starting that this video is sponsored by Audible, but more on that at the end. So the least impactful book was Origin by Dan Brown. This book kind of just felt rushed and a little bit childlike. I didn't enjoy it. The next book was Primal Branding, which I thought was actually an interesting book, but the problem was it could have been summed up in a blog post that was probably less than 1,000 words. So the next one was The Design of Everyday Things, which is supposed to be a really good book. And I feel like I learned a few things from the book, but not a whole lot. Okay, the next one was Utopia, which is a super interesting book. It's a classic, it's really cool. Interesting, and I'm sure kind of revolutionary at the time, but to me, it just didn't hold that much impact. The next book is a short one. It's called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. It's a good reminder, I think, to live your life with mindfulness. But there's some really condescending points and a few things that kind of hit off base. Okay, the next two books, The Veldt and Jonathan Livingston Seagull, both are really short, and so it's kind of difficult to qualify them as books. I mean, The Veldt is definitely not a book, so really I've read 25 books. So The Veldt has really interesting thoughts about, future and technology and the role that technology plays in the world, and it's a really good reminder to be responsible about technology use. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, what I got out of it was this sense of how holy figures are changed over time, and that the idolization of those figures matters more than what they stood for, which is contradictory to what the case should be. I mean, what these figures would want is that their message is what propagates, not who they are. But the opposite is true. So the next book is called Influence. Like, a lot of the book is talking about how you can basically prey on people's subconscious tendencies. The author does say that this is so that people don't prey on your tendencies, which is fair. And I think it's useful to understand what those tendencies might be, but it does just feel a little bit gross and a little bit seedy to be reading about it. So the next book is called Pitch Anything, if you're interested in anything that has to do with pitching. So whether that be pitching a company, which is what the book mainly focuses on, but I could see things like this really coming into play with things like science fair or any other competition really where you're being judged and you have to impress people in a short amount of time and get them to vote for you instead of the other guy. Unlike Influence, it didn't feel seedy. This is using psychology and tactics in a way that feels positive. Next one is Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Strong recommend. Basically, it tells a story about how a lot of the high achievers in the world, yes, they worked hard, but they also got very lucky. These outliers, these people who are very successful, a lot of the things that separate them it's just luck. So the next book is Drive. It's by Daniel Pink. This book is interesting because it talks about motivational structures and the ones that are effective and the ones that aren't. If you're in something with the carrot and the stick model, it takes a lot of the creativity out of it, takes a lot of the fun out of it, and there are other ways to motivate people. So super interesting book if you're interested in motivation. So the next book, Tim Ferriss made it onto the list, The 4-Hour Workweek. The general lesson that I got out of this was that you don't actually have to work as many hours as you think you have to work in order to get good results. So the next book, Nate Silver, The Signal and the Noise. So this book, basically the main lesson that I got out of it was that a lot of predictions that people make end up wrong, and they don't account for events that seemed highly unlikely because we apply probabilistic models to things that maybe we shouldn't be applying those models to. There are some heavy chapters, but then there's also some really interesting chapters where he talks about things like baseball and so on. So the next book is called When. It's another Daniel Pink book. And this book was really interesting to me because it's the first book that I read that really talked about timing. And so what I mean by that is when you're going throughout your day, when are the optimal times to be doing certain activities? So Pink looks at a bunch of studies and makes some recommendations based on it. And there are lessons that you can immediately take away into your own life. All right, next up, Creativity Inc., book by Ed Catmull, who is the CEO of Pixar, Very cool from a memoir perspective, because I love reading memoirs of creative and successful people. But also there's some really good lessons in there about what it takes to build a creative company and the struggle in doing so. Coming in at 10th, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Very interesting book with basically one major point, which is that life will always have problems. No matter how successful you are, no matter how rich you are, you're going to have to be solving problems. Life is not about escaping those problems by making more money or becoming more successful in some arbitrary way. Life is about finding the problems that make you happy to solve. Next up is a book written by an MIT professor, Max Tegmark, called Life 3.0. If you're interested in AI and the potential situations, the potential outcomes of AI, this is somebody who really knows his stuff. So the next book is called Creativity, and it's by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I love reading about the stories of creative and inspirational and successful people, because if there's something that I can learn from their stories, from what they do on an everyday basis that I can apply to my life, well then that's brilliant. What I love about this book is that it's basically a summary of this long research project that they did where they interviewed creative, successful people and just asked them about their life. It took me a long time to get through, but I feel like I learned a lot in doing so. All right, next up is Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. I don't agree with everything in this book. It's basically a philosophy book that talks about how a lot of the things that we design as humans are subject to fragility. So they get worse over time, whereas a lot of the things in the world get better as you apply chaos or as you apply time. So like the world, for example, gets stronger and develops and evolves. So it's super interesting to think about that general concept and then applying that to various aspects of life. And I think that Taleb does this in a very original way, and that's why I like this book so much, is because, with a lot of these books, they're concepts that I have thought about before, but maybe just not deeply, or maybe I see a slightly original perspective on them. With this, it was a completely original idea. It's something that I hadn't thought about ever before. And so while I don't agree with everything in it, it definitely was more thought-provoking than a lot of the other books on here. So now we're on to the really good ones. There are 6 that I consider really, really good, really impactful. And the first one is Mary Oliver. I think it's called New and Selected Poems. I was drawn to Mary Oliver, who is an American poet, because of her poem A Summer's Day, which if you haven't read, pause the video, go read it. It's incredible. And after reading that poem, I just felt drawn to her work, and I felt like I needed to read more. So I ordered an anthology which included that poem because I figured I would see similar work, and I was just blown away. Honestly, I cried a few times reading it. It was unreal. I've never been touched by poetry like that before. If you've never given poetry a shot, this is the one to give it a shot with, in my opinion. And if you have given poetry a shot before, if you are a consumer of poetry and you like poetry, then you definitely need to read more Mary Oliver. She is incredible. So the next book, 10% Happier by Dan Harris. This is basically a book that is what the monk who sold his Ferrari should have been. Dan Harris says, this is my life. These are the major problems that I was facing, including drug addiction. And here is how mindfulness helped me in some small way. And he does it in a really real and human way, at the same time telling a memoir and telling a story about his very interesting life. So the next book is the one that I read the fastest out of any of these. I read it in a single night because I just couldn't put it down. I stayed up till 4 a.m. It's a book about a guy who finds himself. He's just a regular struggling university student who ends up basically traveling the world, ends up in Japan, imports some shoes, and then it takes you along the journey of how that really regular guy ended up forming what is now Nike, what is now the tens of billions of dollars. It's written very humbly. It's written with amazing lessons that he learned along the way about business, but also about life. And it's just written in such a real way. He's not pretending to be somebody else. It's just very human. So the next book, we're into the top 3. It's called Sapiens. It's a history book that talks about the history of Homo sapiens. So who we are as an animal and how we evolved and why we've been so successful in evolving. It had some really interesting and original ideas about religion to me. That was a big one. Also, like, values that we hold, cultural values, and how those have changed over time, and the political ideologies that we now take for granted, like democracy, how that is a fairly recent invention as well, or capitalism, how that's recent as well. Seeing it all together in one cohesive story was amazing. It was really, really great, and I learned a ton from it. And I think that this is something that everybody should know, everybody should read. And so yeah, Sapiens, great book. All right, coming in at number 2 is a book that I've praised a ton on this channel, and it's called Flow. What I love about Flow is that it very concretely answers a lot of the questions that people have about happiness. Like, how do you find happiness in your life, right? I think a lot of people see that as their major goal in life. Like, they just want to be happy. And Flow just gives you the blueprint to do that. And it says, okay, you want to be happy. What are happy people doing? And they're engaged in activities in a very specific way. And so if you want to be happy, engage yourself in activities in that way. This is a book that made my life better. So it's one that I've recommended to a ton of people, and I know a ton of people on my channel have already read and have sent me rave reviews about. So great book. All right, so the number 1 book that I read this year, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the number 1 most impactful book that I've ever read, is called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's a book written by a psychologist who went through the Holocaust in concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And the premise of the book, there's 2 main parts. The first part is talking about his experience during the Holocaust, going through the concentration camps, and talking about how he found meaning even in the hardest times, when he was literally dying of starvation, when he was dying of typhus, etc., how he was able to continue going, and how he was able to maintain hope and meaning, and to understand that somebody in that situation could have hope and have meaning and purpose. And then furthermore, how he was able to forgive, and how he was able to not hold other people guilty and to condemn others that were, making his life miserable, is incredibly inspirational. And it made my heart full, and it tore it apart at the same time. Like, this is an impactful book if you've ever read one. So these were the 26 books that I read this year, ordered from least impact to most impact. And while I believe that reading is a great habit that everyone should get into, a lot of people complain about reading because they don't have the time to do it. They're busy, commuting and working and so on. They don't have hours every day to dedicate to that. And to them, because I've been running into this issue as well, I've found a solution. And the solution is in the sponsor of this video. It's Audible. So if you go to audible.com/johnfish or text johnfish to 500-500, you get a 30-day free trial and a free audiobook. But why would you want to use Audible? What do you actually use Audible for? Well, I'll explain what I've been using it for. So I walk to work, right? It's like a 15-minute walk. It's been really great. So sometimes I listen to music, sure, or podcasts, but I'm a book fanatic. As you know, I love to read. And so Audible has been incredibly useful for me because it allows me to listen to books and to absorb the ideas in books while I'm doing other things. So while I'm walking or while I'm driving, because I've been driving again now that I'm not at school, it's been super great. So again, if you go to audible.com/johnfish or text johnfish to 500-500, you can get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial. If I could recommend one audiobook for you to listen to, it would be the audiobook of Man's Search for Meaning. This book is incredible. This book is the most impactful book that I've ever read. It's something that I believe everyone should read or listen to. The ideas in here need to be heard by more people. That's all I'm going to say. So thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much to Audible for sponsoring this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week.
Put it on the line, put it on the line.